launch straight on into our first speaker for today. Hilary Gyebi-Ababio is the Vice President for Higher Education at the National University of Students, which represents over 7 million students in the United Kingdom. I am delighted to hand over to Hilary for her to speak with us here today.
Thank you so much. Hi, I'm Hilary Gyebi-Ababio from the National Union of Students in the UK, and it's a pleasure to be here. I wanted to especially thank Paul and the team for being so supportive and gracious in bringing this all together. It's certainly been a busy time, but I'm here because they made it all work, so thank you so much. Being here as a student voice is very important to me, as this year has been a lot for the world, but it has especially been a tough year for students. We've seen students have their education halted, their whole experience of teaching and learning flipped on its head, and even more challenging, dealing with a pandemic that seemingly has left a lot of their futures in flux. But what has been even more important is that in the midst of what has been a tragic and difficult year, there is a fresh and alive hope that remains in the student body that we all as a learning community must grasp and maintain as we look forward into not only a post-COVID world, but hopefully a new and transformed world determined to grasp and enact real change. In speaking of real change, there are a plethora of things I can talk about that are on the agenda for change, but I wanted to focus on the fundamental, the core of what and who is important here: students. Students are a lot of things. Firstly, students are who make up our universities. They are the lifeblood. They bring vibrancy, life, and new ideas to the university space. Secondly, students are a great source of innovation. They are markers of change. I haven't been long in the student movement formally, but as long as I'd been a student, I felt in myself and those around me a real sense of energy that constantly pushed us to push the boundaries, test the norms, and challenge the traditions. Lastly, but not limited to this, students are as much the architects of their education as much as they are the recipients of their education. Education, in my opinion, is the constant that shapes and develops people. You don't have to be a 19-year-old to learn, neither must you fit what the typical student is characterized to be. That's important for me to say to you all, because we've got an exceptionally diverse student body. Sorry, our education must not only reflect that, but constantly adapt to that. To be explicit about this, we must work to get students to really be a part of an education system that allows them to feel seen and included in that very education. This year has been a massive wake-up call for our education system and sector to really have a look at itself, its history, and the future course it is forging for itself. For Black students, the resurgence of Black Lives Matter following George Floyd's murder was a wake-up call. For disabled students and students with access needs, the move to digital education was a wake-up call. For A-level and new students, the depletion of face-to-face learning was a wake-up call. For students on widening participation and low-income backgrounds, the financial impact of COVID was a wake-up call. And finally, for all students, the mental health impact of COVID was a wake-up call. Wake-up calls not for them, but for the sector, for those who hold tangible power to take seriously their needs in a holistic way and recognize that for their fundamental right to an education, they need holistic support and their needs met wholly. In this, there is a space in which we must take time to reflect. Have we done enough to ensure there is proactive work being done to support students to thrive? Have we really thought about what it really means to work sustainably in developing education and moving it to a place of really serving the needs of those who depend on it most? And most importantly, have we missed doing the core thing that will enable education to reach its full and real potential and purpose? Whatever your answers to those questions, one thing remains vital moving forward: that students are your partners, and not only that, your colleagues, in really looking to transform and revitalize education from its roots. So I have a few things for you to think about and endeavor to move forward in doing. Number one, trust is the only way to true and authentic partnership. If we are to move forward in ensuring that we do student partnership and we endeavor to do it well, trust needs to be our starting point. To be candid with you, although we've seen students become increasingly involved in work at universities, it has been an uphill climb for students to really feel included and considered in the work being done to shape their education. Students have been shut out, silenced, and minimized to data, to numbers, and not their real life stories and experiences. Just over a week ago today was the anniversary of the 2010 student marches, a real show of the maximum breakdown of trust students had in the institution that made decisions on their behalf. To this day, that sense of distrust and frankly betrayal still hangs in the air. But like I said before, there is hope and opportunity for that trust to be rebuilt and reimagined. It is important that we all, including students, as much as you who work in the sector, um, endeavour to go on a journey of rebuilding trust, upholding respect, and having an openness to listening, learning, and transparency. It is vitally important if we are to really authentically partner with students, that this is a journey of trust and integrity on both sides. Without trust, anything we do is a non-starter. Secondly, partnership, not just critical friendship. When I speak of partnership, I want to emphasize that this is not just student input or student consultation, but instead it is the true inclusion of students in decision-making processes and spaces where change is being formed and built. In this, students are a part of the process rather than an add-on. Often students are invited into spaces where decisions have been pre-made, where they are made to feel like tick box markers to ensure that there is a semblance of resonance with what has been built for them, but not with them. I recently heard a quote secondhand from someone reflecting on how students have stood up to be heard and included in this time that was framed like this. So this was in the context of recent events around housing, but I think it's overarching and universal to the principle of what student partnership looks like. They said, providers must do things with students rather than to them. To do this requires humility and the ability to remove hierarchies in order for students to be viewed as equals in those spaces. I think this is especially important in championing and valuing the work of student union representatives and enabling them to be true critical friends in order to represent the student voice authentically without the worry of being shut out or uninvited into the spaces where change is made. Students have so much to bring to the table and are so willing to work with you. So simply let them. Number three, recognition and reward. My third point is on recognition, because despite not only being included in formal work, students are already proactively doing work to support each other, to promote access to universities for disadvantaged students, and to innovate. You can only look at the winners of these awards today and over the past few days to see that. You need only to look at the clubs and societies and student unions to see societies that I know personally, like the 93% Club, the BME Medics, or African Caribbean societies, to see the proactive and impactful work societies and students are doing. During lockdown, we saw sports societies run to raise money for the NHS charities. Students set up mutual aid groups to support the more vulnerable and their local communities, all because they recognize the importance of community, support, and collective care in the time of crisis, and use the tools they had in more normal times to join in the fight against this pandemic. Often, student work goes unrecognized and, more pertinently, unremunerated. It is important that when students do work, big or small, we are constant champions of them and are forthcoming in resourcing and compensating them for that work. Juggling studies are hard enough, But students are people too, trying to navigate a world that is constantly changing. And for universities and the sector to really encourage, enable, and empower them to thrive, they must give them the support, recognition, resource, and reward they deserve for being unrelenting in going above and beyond to serve the communities they are a part of and beyond. Finally, meaningful commitment with follow through. I wanted to end on this because I've highlighted a lot where universities have fallen short in including students in the ways that students have needed for so long. But I wanted to take a moment to recognize something positive. If there's anything the higher education sector is famous for, other than undecipherable acronyms, it is that when it is willing to change, it does so with commitment. Often these commitments are shows of faith to students that their institutions are willing and ready for change. What's important here is that those commitments are followed through with transparency and the willingness for students to be a part of that journey with their institutions. I think a lot about this in two aspects, in relation to race and in relation to student feedback. Over the summer, we saw a lot of commitments in relation to doing more for Black and BAME students. And that's been interesting because it's caused universities to dig deep in reckoning with their colonial legacies and their past. And with student feedback, the ongoing complicated relationship that students have had with the National Student Survey has really highlighted the importance of moving to a student partnership model as opposed to a student consultation model of working. It is important that with both of these, the change that is needed is done with students being welcomed on that journey and even further being allowed to lead on those journeys with their universities. So to end, look at the students here today, look at the winners, look at all those that participated. They are students who are shaping and will continue to shape not only higher education, but all of education. The key is to enable and empower them to do so. Believe in them, help them believe in themselves, and most importantly, continue to, however uncomfortable and different, let them lead the charge and the way in making education a thing that people love to do and never stop doing. Make sure that they can truly thrive in education. That means working to support them in moving to an education system that is fully funded, lifelong, liberated, and accessible. And finally, always work to ensure that they know that they are valued as people for themselves, not their status or benefit to your work, but as important members of our learning community and world. We are all students, so let us all truly come together as peers to transform education for the better. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Hilary. We have a few questions for you from attendees. So, an attendee asks, why are you so passionate about education? Have you yourself faced any challenges in accessing education?
That is a wonderful question. And so to address the first part of that question, I'm passionate about education for a few reasons. But the reason that always sort of comes to my mind in my first sort of thoughts is that when I like growing up, so I come from a family of educators. My mom was a teacher back in Ghana, and my granddad was a teacher, and my granddad has this firm belief that working in education gives you all the tools you need to do anything else in life. And I think he's right. And so having that instilled into me as a young person, from before I can even remember, really instilled in me the power of education and what education can do. And there's a few things around that. I think education is important because it teaches you to be able to think, to be able to be confident in forming your opinions, your thoughts, your outlook on the world. And I think that's really important. I also think it's important, especially for social mobility, and this is where I come to a more personal side of that question, where you talk about, have I faced any adversities and what have I overcome, and I think first of all it's important for me to say that I am first of all very clearly a Black woman. Um, and my parents both moved from Ghana to the UK to ensure that myself and my siblings could have a better life, better education, better opportunities. And so I'm a child of immigrants. And on top of that, I'm also from a working class, widening participation, whatever language resonates, background. And so there have been a lot of challenges that I have faced in being able, firstly, to even know that I could go on in education to the level of higher education, but also be included and engaged in that space, being a Black woman, being a child of immigrants. And so there were challenges around being included. There were challenges around seeing myself in the education that I was being taught. There were challenges around finance and income. But I think being involved with so many like amazing initiatives like the Social Mobility Foundation, and then going on to work for the widening participation team to help fund myself through university when I didn't frankly have enough money to be able to do everything that I wanted to do there, really got me engaged in being able to pass this work forward and pass it on so students like me and from my background can be at university and thrive. So there's a few challenges I faced, but like for want of time, I could go into detail, but I wanted to make sure that we can maximize this time as much to answer questions. So hopefully that covers everything.
Brilliant, thank you. It does. So another attendee asks us how you think academia could be decolonized.
That's an excellent question. And actually, it's an active piece of work that I'm doing at the National Union of Students. It's one of our priority campaigns. So I think the first thing that I always say when it comes to decolonisation is that education has to come first. And I think education is important because I firmly believe that for us to truly decolonize, we need to be able to understand it from its roots. I think a lot of things have manifested from the colonial legacy, but a lot of that is really just surface. And when you really dig deep, you really get a full understanding of, first of all, the impact of the colonial legacy, and then how to decolonize. And so the first thing that I would say is get educated. You know, there's so many libraries and texts and different forms of media in which you can learn about what the decolonization movement is and how it has manifested and how it can be done in practice, which I think is incredibly important. The second thing that I would do is speak to students. I'm here as a student representative for a reason, and I do this job because I firmly believe that, you know, the people that have been spearheading the decolonization movement before it was even popular or cool to be talking about it were students, from the Why Is My Curriculum White campaign, where they invited lecturers and academics to speak with them about the Eurocentric nature of the curriculum, to so many things that span past the curriculum, whether it's addressing the colonial legacies that are overt at universities, or whether it's actually looking at different spaces of how decolonization can be done in different ways. And so I'd really encourage you to, first of all, like get educated and take that initiative to learn about what decolonization is in its truest form, but engage with students and let them lead, because I think they're really spearheading this in a really impactful way. And they will be the ones that will be nurturing and rebuilding a decolonized education system and world, which I think is exciting, really exciting.
Brilliant, thank you for that. And from a more practical point of view, an attendee asks, what can we do in our own universities to make them more inclusive?
Really good question. So I think I have to go back to my last point on that one, which is speak to students, engage students. I think often universities have intentions to make themselves more inclusive, and I understand the importance of inclusivity in making sure that you have a diverse and rich student community. But I think the thing about inclusivity is that in order to achieve it, you must include those that have been discluded to really understand how to include them.
Mhm.
So all throughout my keynote, I spoke about students as partners, and I really mean it when I talk about students as partners. Not only consulting them, because I think that's sort of the culture that has emerged in higher education, to consult with students, but actually bring them into the room, like let them be part of your decision making processes and let them lead on the decision. Those are weird words to put together. Decision making process, and really allow them to be imaginative and free in those spaces. I think often, universities' intentions to promote inclusivity and really get inclusivity happening authentically fall short, because often students don't view it as an inclusivity measure. They view it just as another university initiative. And I think for the hard work that you all do, which I'm sure you do, to make university a more inclusive space, I think not having students at the center of that, is where it constantly like falls short, and so having students at the center is important. And then I'd go back briefly to my last point, which is decolonization. I think decolonization is important to know that it's not just about race. A large part of it, is about race, but it's about so much more. It's about truly going to the root of the foundations of our education system, and looking at how we can uproot that and actually build an education system that is made for everyone, and not just constantly having to patchwork and try and fit different people into an education system that essentially wasn't built for them. So those are the practical things that I would say, and hopefully they're actionable enough, but I didn't want to be too prescriptive.
Brilliant, thank you. We have one last question. What do you think are the biggest issues that are not currently being addressed in higher education?
That is a really good question. Goodness me, I think about this all the time actually. Um, so there's a few things that are always on my mind. And so I think first of all, anything that I don't say, I think there are the seeds of them being addressed. I'm not mentioning them, not because I don't think they're not problems, but I think they're starting to be addressed but need more attention. But what I would say first of all is that I think then there's a real space where we need to start looking at intersectionality of students in a way that we haven't before. And I'm thinking a lot about this personally in terms of how do we break down widening participation and actually look at the characteristics of students that sort of overlap with one another. So when I was at Bristol as the education officer there, or one of the education officers there, I did a lot of work in looking at class and the continued impact of class on students of different backgrounds and different identities. Um, I also think that there's a real space for us to actually start thinking about how we deliver education in a way that really looks to make the university space a collaborative space. And at the end of my keynote, I mentioned that we are all students, because I think we need to move to an education space where, I think we're still very much in a space where it's like lecturer student relationship. And I'd really love to see an education space that actually encourages students to be as much teachers as they are students, and vice versa. And so I think creating a truly inclusive and authentic learning, teaching, and assessment, like sort of learning, is a real big important space that I think more proactive work needs to be happening across the sector rather than in pockets. And then finally, I always come into these spaces highlighting that, whatever we do, and like this is very non-specific for a reason, but I think in everything we do, we need to look at how we can make education inclusive by design. And that means that, like, in what you do, your liberation work doesn't come as an add-on, but it actually comes part and parcel of whatever you do. And I think especially about that in terms of disabled students who, for example, fought for digital education for so long, and now, it's taken a crisis to bring it. I think about students from the transgender community. I think about LGBT plus students. I think about Black students, BAME students. And I think it's really important that whilst we're seeing a big highlight of certain groups of students really suffering the effects of COVID, but also the pandemic of racism and injustice, I think it's also important to recognize that, all of these bits of liberation are all interlinked. And I'll just finish off this answer on this quote that really speaks to me whenever I think about identifying where I might have gaps in my work, or where I might be needed to think about my work constantly. And it's by Lila Watson. I've been quoting this everywhere. I need to stop at some point. I'll get a t-shirt with it on, so I'll stop. But it says, if you've come here, one second, I want to get it up verbatim because I've got it on my search history. I want to get it up verbatim because I want to give it credit. If you have come here to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. And I think that really speaks to the fact that, sometimes we compartmentalize a lot of the things that we have to deal with, the problems we have to deal with in education. But when we actually recognize that all of these are interlinked, and therefore, when you work for one, you have to work for all, that really causes you to grasp at the root and actually look at how you are addressing the core issues in the different spheres we all work in an effective way. So I think that's my answer, and hopefully it really spoke to the question and was
Brilliant, Hilary.
detailed enough.
Brilliant, thank you. It did. Thank you very much for your time in speaking with us here today and for answering our questions. We really appreciate it.